Good morning, everyone, except those of you in Europe. So, Bob, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be with you for these two virtual workshops today and tomorrow. As you know, the overall goal of the workshop itself, hopefully at some point we'll be able to do the face-to-face workshop, is to really equip participants with the knowledge and the tools to begin the process of working towards national drought, development of national drought management plans and policies in their particular countries. So with these tools and with this knowledge, hopefully you can become advocates for change. And also we hope that a side benefit from both the virtual workshops as well as the eventual face-to-face workshop, if we're able to do that, is to develop in-country and as well as maybe regional networks for information sharing so that you can share lessons learned, successes and failures and so forth. Today, however, what we want to do is to provide some background information on some of the key concepts associated with drought management, particularly more proactive drought management, and some of the resources that are available to you to assist the various
Ustedes para asistir a los diferentes países en el desarrollo de estos programas, planes y políticas, digamos, integrales del manejo de sequía. Como vemos aquí en el título, hay dos conceptos clave que estoy tratando de expresar. En primer término, que los países históricamente han manejado la sequía tratando de administrar a través de los
very reactive in terms of their approach, dealing with the drought after the drought has occurred. And this has resulted in very ineffective and poorly coordinated efforts. So what we want to try to do is to get countries to move towards a more risk reduction strategy in which they're trying to manage the risk, which implies that you have to understand the impacts associated with drought and the vulnerabilities that exist throughout your country. In addition, we have an even greater challenge today because of a changing climate. With the changing climate, the frequency and severity and perhaps the duration of droughts is already changing and will continue to change in the future. So this makes it even more impelling that we adopt a new strategy for dealing with drought as we move forward. So I want to begin with some basics. I think most of you have an understanding of this, but I want to make sure we're all on sort of an equal plane here. And that is, first of all, in terms of defining drought. You all know that there are literally hundreds of definitions of drought. And these tend to be very application and region specific. But drought definitions tend to fall into two categories. They're either conceptual definitions, which is kind of what I'm going to present to you here in this particular slide, or they're more operational definitions. And operational definitions would imply then that you have certain criteria within that definition that allows you to actually monitor drought, its development, its waning, and so forth during a drought period. There are also three key elements, I think, of a definition of drought. What you see in front of you here is drought is a deficiency of precipitation from expected or normal that extends over months, a season, or a longer period of time. And this essentially defines a meteorological drought. And the two of the three key elements of a drought definition, one is the intensity. So how dry is it over that period of time? And secondly, the issue of duration, how long the drought may occur into the future, how long it's occurred in the past. And one of the characteristics of drought as opposed to other natural hazards is in fact its duration. It's not a quick onset, it's a slow onset disaster that evolves over a period of time and then literally can last for months or years. So this defines meteorological drought. But the other key element of a drought definition is its impacts. And it's when we get into the impacts that we start to separate into the different applications of a definition to the issue of drought management. So when we bring in the impacts, we're referring to the insufficiency of precipitation over this period of time to meet the demands of human activities in the environment. And so here we get into things such as agricultural drought or hydrologic drought, socioeconomic drought. And more recently, we've heard more and more about ecological drought. And so all of these are application specific. And so drought is very much like beauty in the sense that it's all in the eyes of the beholder. So the way a farmer looks at drought is very different than an ecologist or an economist or a hydrologist might look at drought. So really, in order to be effective in terms of managing drought, we have to integrate the whole process of drought management across sectors and also within and between levels of government, as well as incorporating the private sector and NGOs and so on as we try to manage drought more effectively. So the typical approach to dealing with drought has been the crisis management approach, and that's illustrated here by a graphic or an illustration that I've used for a long time, which is called the hydroillogical cycle. So when drought begins, there's a gradual buildup of awareness and then concern, culminating then in panic. And this is the crisis approach. So you're trying to deal with a crisis, you're trying to deal with the impacts as they are occurring, after they are occurring. Then when it begins to rain, we quickly enter a period of apathy. And we then wait for the next drought. So what we're essentially trying to do here is we want to intervene in this process, and we want to try and break this hydroillogical cycle and intervene following a drought when we have the lessons learned from the drought, what worked and what didn't work in terms of emergency response. But we want to put together a preparedness strategy for the next drought, because drought is a normal part of climate. And this preparedness strategy really needs to be based upon risk reduction. And so dealing with this means that in a more effective way means that we must move to a new paradigm for drought management. So what are the incentives for moving to this new paradigm? First of all, the spiraling impacts associated with drought in essentially all countries and across multiple sectors. A more proactive strategy for dealing with drought would also reduce conflicts between water users, make water management more efficient. It promotes the wise stewardship of natural resources. So where we're talking about sustainable development and sustainable growth, it's important that we improve the stewardship of those natural resources that drought is so critical in terms of how it affects them. It also reduces the need for government assistance. And so you can, the resources saved, both human resources and financial resources, the resources saved can be invested then in a more proactive approach to drought. So essentially, we're talking about a transfer of resources to more proactive approach as opposed to a more reactive approach to dealing with drought. And again, this is particularly important because we're seeing the increased frequency and severity of drought as we move forward. And much of this associated, of course, with the changes in climate that we're seeing. And another key point here is people say, well, it takes resources in order to develop preparedness plans. And yes, it does. But on the other hand, you have to include here the cost of inaction. So what are the costs of not doing anything? What's the cost of remaining in a more reactive approach to drought? And so we have to weigh the cost of action versus the cost of inaction. And certainly we feel that becoming more proactive is a much better use of resources in the long term. So what we are doing in these two virtual workshops is really providing you with some of the background information for what has come before this workshop. There's been a lot of work on this area of proactive drought management, focusing on risk reduction. And a lot of this culminated in the meeting, the high-level meeting on national drought policy that was held in 2013. And one of the things that was unique about this particular event was bringing together three organizations of the United Nations, WMO, UN Convention to Combat Desertification, and the Food and Agriculture Organization, who all focus on this issue of drought risk reduction and how we can stimulate the development of drought management plans and policies worldwide. There were more than 80 countries that attended this particular meeting and produced a document that really called for all nations to develop national drought policies. So there were a lot of things that came out of this particular meeting that continued to promote this idea of drought risk reduction. One was the Integrated Drought Management Program that was established through the efforts of WMO and the Global Water Partnership in 2013. And this program continues today. And Bob Stefanski is going to talk more about that tomorrow. In addition, there have been a number of reports that have come out of that particular program. One is a report that I developed for the IDMP, which promoted the 10-step planning process as essentially guidelines for the development of national drought management plans and policies. And this is available in all the languages of the United Nations. Also coming out of the high-level meeting on national drought policy was a series of regional capacity building workshops to spread the word to sort of disseminate more information about drought risk reduction and how to do that to countries throughout the world. So we organized between 2013 and 2015 a series of 6 regional capacity building workshops in essentially all regions of the world. And there were over 75 countries that participated in these particular workshops. And I think they were quite effective in terms of promoting this idea of development of national drought management policies and plans. In addition, the UNCCD worked to continue this operation through the UNCCD Drought Initiative. And Daniel Sequía is going to talk about that more tomorrow. So that's another important outcome of the high-level meeting on national drought policy in 2013. So the task of developing, obviously, a drought management plan for a country and based on the principles of risk reduction is certainly a challenging task, but this is important in order to move from managing disasters to managing risks. And so in this first presentation, I wanted to let you know that there are resources available to assist countries in this process. So you are not alone in this process. You can rely on the expertise of many organizations that have been involved in this activity throughout, including the National Drought Mitigation Center in the United States. And you'll hear from Mark Swoboda tomorrow, who's the director of the National Drought Mitigation Center. So with that, to save some time, I think, Guillermo, I'm gonna skip over the short question period we had here because we're running behind schedule and talk a little bit more about the rationale for the development of drought management plans and policies.
Please go on.
First of all,
Go on, Don. You have about 13 minutes. Go ahead.
Okay. First of all, the cycle of disaster management. The way we've typically dealt with drought in the past is, as I said, through this crisis management approach. And so that's the lower portion of this particular diagram. that really focuses on addressing the impacts through a reactive response and recovery from the event. And so crisis management really treats the symptoms of drought, in other words, the impacts, and not really the causes as to why these impacts are occurring. In other words, it does not address the vulnerabilities that are resulting in these impacts. So we need to shift the emphasis. There's always a need for an emergency response, but we need to shift the emphasis to more of a risk management approach, which is focused upon increasing coping capacity and building resilience. And so this approach tends to promote this paradigm shift that I referred to earlier, to move away from managing drought as a disaster and trying to manage the risk in a proactive manner. And so there are different characteristics of crisis management versus risk management. First of all, crisis management is quite expensive, and it tends to repeat the mistakes of the past. So inefficiency or ineffectiveness in that response tend to get repeated because we tend to do the same thing. Governments do the same thing responding to droughts as they occur into the future. They're focusing on post-impact. It rewards poor resource management in that those people that are most eligible for some sort of drought relief or drought assistance are the poorer resource managers. And so it really treats the symptoms of drought and once again, not the causes. Risk management, on the other hand, does require some upfront costs, both in the short term and the long term. It's pre-impact cost associated with doing risk assessments and putting together or defining mitigation programs that tend to address the vulnerability associated with drought so that you reduce the risk for the next drought. And so when we talk about risk, we're really talking about the combination of understanding the hazard, which is defined as the exposure to drought. And so the exposure to drought obviously varies within a country based upon the different climatic controls and so on, but also the vulnerability. The vulnerability is based upon social factors, such as population growth, shifts in population, urbanization, water use trends, environmental degradation, and so on. So when we look at reducing risk, we have to understand not only the exposure of different regions to drought, but we also have to understand the social factors that are resulting in this vulnerability. And we have to address that vulnerability through the development of mitigation programs. So what are the incentives to move forward? They're the ingredients of developing more of a drought management and policy. First of all, it requires political will and leadership. And we're going to hear about some of that in a few minutes in a vignette from Mexico. It requires some initial investment, but you have to equate this with the cost of inaction, the cost of doing nothing. It requires obviously a collaborative environment because drought cuts across so many different sectors, so many different agencies of government and so on, that you have to have improved coordination within and between levels of government. You have to engage stakeholders, the research community, and you also need to have a strong outreach and media program so that you're communicating the changes that you're trying to make in a more proactive approach to drought management. So the vision here is that you develop a national drought plan and policy, and underneath the principles of that risk reduction strategy, you develop subnational preparedness plans that once again are based on these principles that are defined in the National Drought Plan and the National Drought Policy. So a national drought policy really needs to be very broadly stated. It needs to have a clear set of risk-based principles or guidelines to govern drought management. Policy could be part of a disaster risk reduction or climate change adaptation framework or it could be standalone. It needs to be consistent and equitable for all regions, population growth, population groups, economic and social sectors, and consistent with the goals of sustainable development while reflecting the differences in drought characteristics, vulnerabilities, and impacts from one region to another. And so we promote the principles of risk management through the development of early warning and delivery systems, preparedness plans, risk vulnerability assessments. In other words, we're trying to determine who and what is at risk and why. Mitigation actions that are aimed at reducing impacts, and a more coordinated emergency response. So there's always a need for some emergency response, but it needs to be, the coordination of that needs to be much better, and it needs to be filling in around the more proactive approach that's been put in place prior to a drought event occurring. So here we come down to some of the key components of a drought management plan, drought management policy. And these are the three pillars of drought policy and preparedness. And Bob Stefanski is going to talk more about these tomorrow. But you have, first of all, the monitoring early warning system, risk and vulnerability impact assessment, and mitigation and response. So these pillars must work together, must be integrated across the different sectors and across the different agencies of government in order to be effective. And we'll have more time to discuss that as we go forward. So the takeaway messages here is a drought is a normal part of climate. We're trying to deal with changing precipitation patterns in terms of amounts, seasonal distribution, and form. Increasing temperatures is increasing the demand for evapotranspiration and so on. And this is affecting drought severity, frequency, and duration. Past drought management activities have been mainly reactive. And this means that we've been essentially following this crisis management approach, which is quite ineffective and doesn't really do anything to reduce the vulnerability to the next drought. And so we really need to be focusing on increasing our resilience to drought by managing the impacts in these various sectors. So this implies that we need to take a more integrated approach within and between levels of government that focus on these three pillars that I talked about a couple of minutes ago. The time is really now to change this paradigm, to focus on drought risk management as opposed to crisis management, and keeping in our minds the fact that we have to look at the costs associated with moving towards a more proactive approach has to be weighed against the costs of inaction. Not only the human costs, the economic costs, and so on, but also the environmental costs associated with the lack of action. So with that, I'm going to stop, and if we have some specific questions, Guillermo, are you going to try and coordinate those to the extent that that's possible?
Yes, Don, I will. Let me ask the first question that we received. You talked about coordination, and a question from Jose Marengo in Semaden is how to reconcile national level and state level drought policies.
Well, I think at the national level, we need to establish what I refer to as sort of the principles of drought risk management or risk reduction here. So what is it that we're trying to achieve at a national level? And then these can be adjusted or modified at the state or provincial level, at a more local level, according to how the vulnerabilities change. Because at the state level, if you compare one state to another state within a country, the vulnerability is going to be quite different. Some states may be more agricultural. Some states are more, say, tourist oriented, more urbanized, and so on. So we need to tailor or modify and adjust these principles of risk management to the more local level or subnational level.
Thank you, Don. Another question from Diego Almeida, in Embrapa is, how do you define the drought risk that results from the overuse of hydrological resources through time? He mentions that in previous years, some events, meteorological droughts may not have been worrisome, but nowadays the same precipitation may cause greater risks because of exhaustion of groundwater, essentially, I guess.
Yeah, so here we get into a distinction between, I think, what we refer to as drought and what we might refer to as water scarcity. Because through overdevelopment of hydrologic resources, we can create a situation that even with normal rainfall, we have a shortage. And so we have to distinguish between a shortage of water that's resulting from an abnormal and prolonged deficiency of precipitation associated with maybe higher temperatures versus overdevelopment that essentially has led to a chronic water shortage within a region. And so these two can work together to exacerbate the situation, obviously. But I think it's important for people to understand the difference between a drought, which is a shorter term event, versus water scarcity, which can be associated again with overdevelopment of the hydrologic resources.
Thanks again, Don. One question from Dr. Hori at the IDB. It's actually several questions. Number one, what are the results or positive impacts of having national droughts and policies in some countries? What lessons from other countries that have adopted national drought policies can we learn that would be applicable to the CSA member countries?
Well, the process of developing these national drought policies and plans are referred to is, this is a concept that's currently spreading around the globe. And so there are beginning to be some, I think, good examples of how these are improving the management of droughts when they occur. But we're still in the early, I think, formative stages of learning those things. But I think what we've seen so far, and certainly what we've seen, for example, in the United States, where there's been a movement to more preparedness for drought as opposed to reacting to drought, is that it reduces the economic losses associated with drought. It also reduces environmental losses and the social costs associated with drought. And this improved coordination that occurs largely because of improved information development and information flow and delivery out to users has really been beneficial in terms of bringing people together to work on a more integrated approach. So I think there are a lot of benefits associated with this, and we're going to see those benefits continue to increase in the future. And again, the corollary to that is that we continue to manage drought through this ineffective reactive approach in which there really is very little that's done to change the vulnerability by governments responding through drought relief and drought assistance. In fact, there's considerable evidence that a reactive approach to drought actually increases vulnerability because it increases the reliance on the government rather than individual improvement in resilience.
The interesting question from Gustavo Villauria, how to work on the perception of farmers in this case or any other stakeholders affected by drought before an event develops?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of awareness building, and this is why one of the ingredients that I mentioned here was a strong outreach and media program. Because if a country is going to be trying to move away from or shift the emphasis from a reactive to a more proactive approach, this change in paradigm must be communicated to people so that they understand what the goals of this are, and to understand how changes in management practices can reduce the impacts and therefore the need for government assistance. So it increases the resilience, whether it's farmers, whether it's local water supply systems, and so on. So education, awareness building is really a key part of this whole process.
Thank you, Don. From Liliana Villanueva, earlier you had talked about national level and state level. Now, Liliana asks, how do you reach the bottom, not the bottom in a good sense, individuals with drought policies?
Yeah, once again, I think it comes down to communication and awareness building. You know, if once the principles of drought risk reduction and that approach are formulated at the national scale, these are communicated down to the state level. And so from the state level, there has to be communication of these principles to the local level, to local communities, to local farmers, and so on, so that they understand the benefits associated with taking a more proactive approach. And so this is not something that happens overnight, obviously. So there's a transition that has to occur as you're moving from this more crisis management approach that we've done in the past to a more proactive approach now.
From Jorge Lulu from Embrapa in Brazil, how do you evaluate, I guess he's talking about interbasin transfer between different river basins as a solution to supply water to natural dry regions. He cites the example of the San Francisco River in northern Brazil.
Yeah, interbasin transfer of water resources from one area to another is politically a very sensitive issue. We have that issue certainly in the United States. And so there are laws, water rights, and so on that have to be dealt with when you're moving water from what might be considered to be a water surplus area to a water deficit area. So this is something that has to be done, I think, largely through the political process within a sub-region or within a region to determine both the economic cost, but also the environmental and the social cost of doing that.
Thanks, Don. The last one, and please be brief because we're running a bit late, but it's an interesting one. From Leandro Diaz, the Global Water Partnership in Argentina, he asks if it's important to promote drought plans or policies at the basin level, because he argues that the local stakeholders know the cost of inactions better than maybe national authorities, and they're the most interested ones in changing or in switching to risk management rather than a reactive mode.
Yeah, I mean, this is implied in the term integrated drought management, because we're trying to integrate the management of drought between different sectors, but also between different regions. So this can be at the state level, but obviously development of drought management plans, whether it's for an urban area at a state level or a river basin area, these have to be integrated. So this is a huge challenge, but it's critical that there be this sort of seamless understanding where we've got river basins working together with the states that they intersect with. And so we bring these ideas and so on together so that there's a mutual understanding of the process and how this is going to benefit in terms of drought risk reduction moving forward. But that's a difficult question, but it is a major challenge.
Thank you, Don. Thank you very much for your presentation. Muchas gracias a todos por sus preguntas.